Hello? Tonight, we open an old case file, but one that has never rested. Our first piece of evidence is not in a museum. It's a location, a bowl of dust and stone in the Theban hills on the west bank of the Nile, opposite the modern city of Luxor. It's a place called Deir el-Medina. To a tourist, it looks like a ruin, a collection of low mud brick walls, indistinguishable from the desert that tries to reclaim it. It is hot, silent, and isolated. But this is not just another ruin. This is the lockbox. This is the place that was built to be forgotten. The secret headquarters for the most sensitive, high-stakes construction project in the ancient world. For 500 years, this tiny walled village was home to the men who built the Valley of the Kings. And the evidence they left behind, the lives they recorded, is so personal, so uncensored, that you may not want to be there when the truth surfaces. Before we continue, please like and subscribe. Only if you truly enjoy this investigative storytelling style. This file is on the secret lives of the tomb builders. What are your hypotheses about the men who knew where every pharaoh was buried? Dim the lights, open your skeptical eyes, and enter the case file. The common fact, the one we all know, is the Valley of the Kings itself. This wadi, this dry river valley, is the most famous cemetery on earth. It was the New Kingdom's solution to the problem that plagued the pyramid builders: tomb robbery. The pharaohs, starting with Thutmose I, abandoned the conspicuous mountain-sized monuments of Giza and chose a different path: secrecy. They decided to hew their eternal homes deep into the limestone cliffs in a remote, easily guarded, and secret valley. For 500 years, the greatest pharaohs in history, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, Ramesses the Great, Tutankhamun, were all buried here in 63 known tombs. This is the official story, a story of gods, kings, and gold. But our case file is not about them. It's about the men who held the chisels, the men who spent their entire lives cutting these tombs, painting these books of the dead on the walls, and then presumably taking the secret to their graves. This is where the case file opens, because this is where the odd, lesser-known details found. These men, this elite, highly skilled workforce of stonemasons, plasterers, sculptors, and artists, were not slaves, and they did not live among the general population of Thebes. They, and their entire families, were housed in this custom-built, isolated, and guarded village, Deir el-Medina. They called this place Set Ma'at, the place of truth. The state, it seems, gathered all of its most trusted artisans, the men who held the keys to eternity and quarantined them from the rest of the world. The village was walled. It had its own guards at the gate. The men would commute a long, arduous hike over the Theban cliffs to their office, the Valley of the Kings, where they would work in 10-day shifts, camping at the site. This was a secret, closed ecosystem. Historians still debate the true motive for this isolation. Was this all about secrecy? Was the village a gilded cage, a polite prison designed to stop the world's most valuable secret, the map of the royal tombs, from ever leaking out? Or was this something else? Was it a logistical necessity, a way to keep a vital workforce organized? Or was it a privilege, a mark of their elite status, a way to protect them from the outside world rather than protecting the world from them? The village was built to be forgotten. For nearly 3,000 years, it was. But it was here, in the garbage pits and on the floors of their ruined houses, that the workers left the evidence they were literate and they wrote everything down. This was not a silent workforce. This was a community that left behind a secret archive of its own, an uncensored, unfiltered look at the real lives of the men who built heaven for the pharaohs. The secret walled village of Deir el-Medina, the place of truth, was a paradox. It was a quarantine, as we saw in Section 1, but it was also a place of immense privilege. The common fact, the one that has shaped our view of all great Egyptian projects, comes from the Giza pyramids. We are conditioned to see those monuments as the work of a vast, conscripted, and disposable labor force. We have an image of slaves toiling under the whip. And so we assume that the men who built the Valley of the Kings were just a later, more secretive version of the same system. This assumption is entirely wrong. This is the odd lesser-known detail that changes everything. The men of Deir el-Medina were not slaves. They were not conscripts. They were perhaps the most elite, respected, and well-compensated blue-collar workforce in the entire ancient world. They had a formal, prestigious title, Semdet Onset Mayat, the servants in the place of truth. This was not just a job title, it was a mark of their elite status. This was a permanent, salaried, state-sponsored position, often passed down from father to son, a hereditary guild of irreplaceable specialists. The physical evidence for this is not in a grand monument, but in the same humble garbage pits that held their other secrets. We have their pay logs, we have the state's meticulously detailed salary lists, written on ostraka, those pottery shards we mentioned, and these records show a level of compensation that would be unthinkable for a common farmer. They were paid in goods, but this was not a simple ration. It was an abundant salary. A standard worker received massive monthly allotments of emmer wheat for bread and barley for beer. But it didn't stop there. The logs show they also received fish, vegetables, oils, salt, firewood, and even luxuries like fine linen, honey, and imported wine. The state provided everything. This was a deliberate, calculated policy. You cannot build a flawless, eternal afterlife for a god-king with a resentful, unskilled, and temporary workforce. The work, as we'll see, was brutal, but it was specialized. These men were not just hauling stone. They were the finest artists, sculptors, draftsmen, and painters in the empire. Most importantly, they were literate. They were the scribes who could correctly, and without a single error, paint the complex magical spells, the maps of the underworld known as the Book of the Dead, onto the tomb walls. A single mistake in a hieroglyph could doom the pharaoh to an eternity of torment. Historians still debate whether this enormous privilege was purely a reward for their unique, sacred skills, or if it was a calculated bribe for their silence. Was the state paying them for their artistry, or was it paying them to ensure they would never, ever speak of the secret locations and the golden treasures they were sealing into the earth? The evidence suggests it was both. These men were a protected class. They had their own houses, their own doctors provided by the state, their own servants, and, as we'll see, their own lavish tombs. They were the ultimate insiders, the men who held the pharaoh's eternal life in their paint-stained hands. This unique position, highly paid, isolated, literate, and indispensable, gave them something else, a profound collective sense of their own importance. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what they were worth, and as this case file will show, they were not afraid to use that knowledge as a weapon. we have established our workforce, a privileged, hereditary, and well-paid guild of specialists. They were the servants in the place of truth, as we saw in Section 2, a class apart, living in their isolated, state-funded village. This paints a picture of a comfortable, almost academic life. The common fact that reinforces this is the result of their work, the tombs themselves. When we walk into the tomb of Seti I or Ramesses, we are overwhelmed by the beauty. The art is perfect, serene, and otherworldly. The hieroglyphs are precise. The colors are vibrant. This level of perfection suggests a calm, contemplative, and almost religious working environment. This is an illusion. The beauty of the final product completely masks the brutality of its creation. The daily grind for these men was not serene. It was a 9 to 10 hour shift of back-breaking, hazardous labor, performed in conditions that a modern engineer would declare uninhabitable. Our evidence for this is Exhibit C, the daily work logs. Once again, these are not on grand papyrus scrolls, but on ostraca, those humble shards of limestone and pottery. The village scribes, the foremen of the gangs, they were split into a left side and right side gang, were obsessive record keepers. They tracked everything, and their daily attendance sheets are the most revealing and human documents in this entire file. Let's reconstruct the job. The workers would hike over the steep cliff path from Deir el-Medina to the Valley of the Kings. They would then descend into a rock-cut tomb that was, by definition, a tunnel. The air was still, thick, and hot. The only light came from smoky castor oil lamps which consumed the precious oxygen and coated the walls and their lungs with oily soot. The primary job of the masons was to cut through solid limestone, using nothing but bronze chisels and wooden mallets. The air would have been a choking cloud of pulverized limestone dust. We have the medical reports also on ostraca of men being treated for eye infections, respiratory problems, and stone fragments in their eyes. This is the odd, lesser-known detail that this case file hinges on, the official sick lists. The scribes kept a meticulous record of why men were absent from the worksite, and these lists are a window straight into the reality of their lives. Some reasons are exactly what you'd expect from a hazardous job: stung by a scorpion, injured by a stone block, sick, or sore eyes. But then we find the other reasons. Scribe Amenecht, in the 28th year of Ramesses III, notes an artisan named Merir was absent. The reason? Arguing with his wife. Let that sink in. This was an official entry in a state work log. Another man, Paneb, is listed as absent for brewing beer, a valid reason, as beer was their salary and a staple. Another is absent because his wife was bleeding, a clear and accepted reference to menstruation. Another is absent to build his own house or to mummify his father. Historians still debate the true meaning of these attendance logs. Was this evidence of a surprisingly modern and humane management system, one that recognized that its elite workers had complex private lives, and that a family argument or a personal errand was a legitimate reason to miss a day? Or was this something far colder? Was the scribe simply making a note for his superiors, the vizier, to prove that the foreman was not negligent, that the man-hours were lost for a specific reason, and that the worker, not the manager, was accountable for the delay? The evidence suggests a system that was both. These men were not cogs. They were indispensable, highly skilled assets, And like any valuable asset, they were tracked, maintained, and given a surprising amount of leeway so long as the work ultimately got done. But as we're about to see, these literate, privileged men were not just writing down sick day excuses. They were writing everything. The sick lists we investigated in Section 3, with their strange human excuses, were just the beginning. They were the official state-facing records. But the real secret of Deir el-Medina, this place of truth, wasn't in their attendance logs. It was in their trash. The common fact, known to all Egyptologists, is that papyrus was the official medium of the Egyptian state. It was expensive, state-controlled, and reserved for important documents, religious texts, tax records, and royal decrees. But the common man, even an elite one, needed to write. He needed to make lists, send notes, practice his letters, and file complaints. For this, he used the ancient world's equivalent of a scrap of paper, a sticky note, a text message. He used an ostrakhan. This is our next and most crucial piece of evidence. Exhibit D, a simple, broken piece of pottery or a flat chip of limestone, worthless in itself, but covered in ink. Deir el-Medina was a village of literates, a town of scribes and artists who knew how to write, and they were isolated. This combination created a perfect, sealed-off, cultural petri dish. And in that dish, they wrote everything down. The garbage dumps of this tiny village have yielded a treasure trove of tens of thousands of these ostraca. This is the odd, lesser-known detail that makes this case file possible. This is the secret archive. These are not grand pronouncements about the gods or eternity. This is the raw, uncensored, and often petty record of their daily lives. We have ostraca that are laundry lists. We have a note from one man to his wife complaining that she hasn't sent him his clean clothes. We have a letter from one woman to another, starting a bitter feud over a borrowed tool. We have shopping lists. We have love poems. We have copies of famous literature scribbled out by students practicing their hand. We have angry legal complaints about a donkey that was sold but not delivered, or a worker who stole a chisel. We have the doodles and sketches of the artists practicing a new face or a difficult hieroglyph before they carved it onto the golden walls of the Pharaoh's tomb. We have the innermost thoughts of these men. We have a record of one foreman, Paneb, who was accused by his rival of bribery, theft, and adultery with the wives of his fellow workmen. It is an entire uncensored village soap opera written in ink and preserved for 3,000 years. This is the real place of truth. It was not the tombs they built for the pharaohs. It was the garbage pile where they threw their own stories. Historians still debate whether these ostraca were ever considered private. In a tiny, walled village of a few hundred people, was a note accusing your neighbor of theft a secret, or was it a form of public record, a public shaming? When a foreman wrote down, arguing with his wife, was it an administrative note, or was it gossip? What is clear is that this archive, this avalanche of personal messages, gives us a 3D high-resolution picture of a community that we have for no one else. We know their names, who they married, who they hated, and what they worried about. And these ostraca, these daily records of their anxieties, preserve the single most extraordinary event in the village's 500-year history. They were about to weaponize their literacy. They were about to take their complaints from a private feud to a national crisis. We have now established our scene, a village of literate, privileged, and indispensable artisans. We have their private letters, their laundry lists, their love poems, and their petty feuds, all preserved on the scraps of pottery they left behind. We know, as we saw in Section 4, that these men were not silent cogs in a machine. They were a real community with real anxieties, and in the 29th year of the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, those anxieties boiled over into a full-blown crisis. The common fact that historians of this period know is that the great new kingdom was in trouble. The Sea Peoples had launched a massive failed invasion that, while repelled, had exhausted the empire's treasury. The state was overextended. Grain prices were fluctuating wildly. The central government in the distant north, per Ramesses, was becoming corrupt and logistically inept. The Golden Age was tarnishing. This is the backdrop for our next piece of evidence. It is not a humble ostracon. It is Exhibit E, the Turin Strike Papyrus, and it is the official scribal record of the first ever recorded labor strike in human history. This is the odd, lesser-known detail that changes this case file from a social history to a political thriller. The servants in the place of truth, this elite salaried workforce we detailed in Section 2, stopped getting paid. Their massive, guaranteed monthly salaries of grain, fish, and beer simply stopped arriving. The papyrus and the related ostraca are a minute-by-minute account of what happened next. The rations were late. Then they were weeks late. The scribe's log notes the rations were 18 days late in the month. The men, who had no other source of food, were starving, and so they did the unthinkable. They used the one weapon they had. They walked off the job. The ostraca, the workers' own messages, are frantic. "We are hungry," they wrote. "It is on account of hunger and thirst that we are committing this offense." The papyrus, written by a scribe sympathetic to their plight, records the event. The men laid down their chisels, they walked out of the Valley of the Kings, they breached their own quarantine, marching out of their walled village, a massive security failure, and sat down in protest at the gates of the Ramesseum, the great mortuary temple of Ramesses II. Imagine the scene. The most secret workforce in the world, the men who held the keys to eternity, were now on a public picket line, shouting their grievances at the temple priests. "We are hungry." Their strike was not for more pay or better conditions. It was for the payment of the salary the state had already promised them. Historians still debate the true resonance of this act. Was this, as some have argued, a sign that the entire social contract between the pharaoh and his most elite workers was now completely broken? Or was this a localized logistical failure, a corrupt official in Thebes siphoning off the grain, an event that was shocking because it was so rare? The records show the strike worked for a time. The panicked temple officials brought out the rations to appease them. But the papyrus also shows the problem was not solved. The strikes happened again and again. The system was breaking. This was a community that knew its own worth. They used their literacy to record their grievances and their collective unity to take direct action against the state. This act proves they were not prisoners in a gilded cage. They were a powerful, organized union, and this breakdown of trust, this realization that the state could or would not protect them, would lead them inevitably to their darkest and final secret. The strikes we investigated in Section 5 were a sign of a profound rupture. The state, for the first time, had failed its most elite, most secret workforce. The servants in the place of truth had been forced to shout, "We are hungry," in the streets. This was not just a pay dispute, it was a breakdown of the entire 500-year-old contract. And this breakdown, this new corrosive atmosphere of corruption and state failure, would unlock the village's final and darkest secret. The common fact, known to everyone who studies Egypt, is that tomb robbery was a national sport. It was the great sin. From the moment the first pyramid was sealed, thieves were trying to get in. The entire New Kingdom project, the Valley of the Kings itself, was a direct response to this. It was an attempt to create a secret, secure cemetery, but the pharaohs who hid their tombs in that remote wadi were simply creating the most concentrated, tempting treasure chest in the ancient world. The official records, like the famous Ebers Papyrus from the reign of Ramesses IX, are the reports of a government in crisis, investigating a rash of high-profile robberies. They detail a commission sent by the vizier to inspect the tombs and see which ones had been breached. This is the official story, the state versus the anonymous bandits. But this is where the case file turns inward, back to Deir el-Medina. This is the odd, lesser-known detail that is the village's true legacy. The great tomb robberies were not the work of random desert bandits. They were an inside job. The other papyri from this period, the trial confessions, are the proof. These are chilling documents. They are the transcripts of men captured and brought before the vizier, being interrogated. And the interrogation method was simple: beating with the rod until they confessed. And they did confess. They confessed in agonizing, specific detail. They named their accomplices. They listed the tombs they had breached, and the names on those confession lists, the men being beaten, are not strangers. They are the servants in the place of truth. They are the foremen, the stonemasons, the scribes, and the artists of Deir el-Medina. The men who were paid to build the tombs were the first ones to loot them. Why? The motive is the dark shadow of the strikes. The state had taught them that their loyalty was worthless. When the state's grain shipments failed, they were left to starve. They were the men who had spent their entire lives surrounded by unimaginable wealth, the divine flesh of the gods, gold. And they knew exactly where it was. They didn't need a map. They had drawn the maps. They knew which walls were false. They knew how to bypass the rubble-filled shafts. They knew the inventory. The confessions describe it all. How they would form a small team, go out at night, and tunnel from an adjacent unfinished tomb into the burial chamber of a pharaoh. They describe the act of stripping the pharaoh, of ripping the gold foil mask from the mummy's face, of breaking open the sarcophagus, and of tearing the gold amulets one by one from the linen bandages. They would melt the gold down immediately to destroy the evidence, and then go back to their state-funded homes. Historians still debate whether this was the work of a few bad apples, like the notorious foreman Paneb, who was accused of everything from theft to adultery, or if it was a systemic, community-wide conspiracy. Was the whole village in on it? When a stonemason suddenly had a surplus of silver to buy fine linen for his wife, did his neighbors ask where it came from, or did they just want their own cut? The evidence points to a rot that was deep, pervasive, and a tragic, inevitable consequence of a broken system. The place of truth had become a den of thieves. The common fact that closes the story of Deir el-Medina is that the village was eventually abandoned. By the reign of Rameses the Aphandos, the last king of the new kingdom, the state had completely collapsed. The place of truth was no longer safe. Civil war and Libyan raids made the isolated village indefensible. The state, which had already failed to pay its workers, now failed to protect them. The last of the servants in the place of truth were moved for their own safety inside the high, fortified walls of the Medinet Habu temple complex. The village, Set Ma'at, was left to the desert. The great project was over. The Valley of the Kings was sealed not by priests, but by chaos. This is the official end, but it is not the end of our case file. The most stunning, personal, and paradoxical piece of evidence was left behind, on the hills above their own village. This is the odd, lesser-known detail: their own tombs. The men who spent their lives digging and decorating the eternal homes of the pharaohs spent their off hours building their own. And these tombs are, in a word, breathtaking. They are a mirror image of the royal tombs, a valley of the kings, in miniature. They are not the simple graves of a humble working class. They are extravagant, elaborate, and shockingly beautiful. The tomb of a foreman like Inherkau or an artist like Pashedu is a masterpiece. The walls are covered in the same vibrant yellows, reds, and blues. The artwork is just as skilled, but the content is where the file turns. They did not just copy the royal books of the dead, they personalized them. They are shown wearing their finest semi-translucent linen, sitting with their wives, enjoying a feast in the afterlife. They are shown being judged by Osiris, just as the pharaohs were, but most tellingly, we see scenes of their daily life. We see them farming in a perfect, idealized version of Egypt. In the tomb of Sennacherib, the artisan is shown plowing a field in the afterlife, a scene of pure, tranquil bliss. This is the final stunning statement from the men who knew death better than anyone. They had spent their lives surrounded by the reality of it: the hard rock, the toxic dust, the state corruption, and the rotting mummies they had stripped of their gold. And in the face of all that, the cynicism of the strikes, the criminality of the robberies, they still chose to invest all of their personal wealth and skill into this one singular belief that they too deserved eternity. Historians still debate the true meaning of these tombs. Was this the ultimate act of genuine piety? Proof that despite the corruption, these men truly believed in the Mahat they were painting? Or was it the ultimate act of hubris? Was it a leak from the Valley of the Kings, an appropriation of royal-only spells and imagery, a statement that they, the artisans, were just as divine as the kings they served and secretly looted? Coda. Let's close the file. We return, one last time, to Exhibit A. The ruined mud brick walls of Deir el-Medina, a lockbox left open to the desert. For centuries, this place was just a ruin. We thought the story was in the Valley of the Kings. We were wrong. The story was here. The place of truth was not a title. It was a contradiction. The truth was not the gold of the pharaohs. The truth was in Exhibit D, the ostraka. The truth was a laundry list, a love poem, a doodle, a sick day excuse for arguing with his wife. The truth was in Exhibit E, the Turin Strike Papyrus, the record of a starving, organized union shouting, "We are hungry," at a failed state. And the truth was in the trial confessions, the chilling, beaten-out testimony of an inside job, the story of the men who built heaven and then looted it. This case file was never about the pharaohs. It was about the men who lived in their shadow. The servants in the place of truth were a perfect paradox. They were the most elite and privileged workforce in the ancient world, and they were the first organized labor union. They were the most pious artists, painting the gods with a skill that has never been matched, and they were the most cynical thieves, stripping those same gods of their gold. They were not slaves. They were not anonymous cogs. They were us, literate, proud, anxious, petty, skilled, loyal, and corrupt. And in their own magnificent tombs, they left their final defiant message that the men who build eternity for others ultimately just want a small piece of it for themselves, for themselves, for themselves.